motion adopted by the committee on November 2nd. We're resuming a study in the defense of space, and joining us for this hour is Christian Liebruck, Professor RMC, a familiar face with this committee, and Thomas Hughes, postdoctoral fellow at Frank McKenna School in Mount Allison University. So I'm going to ask each of you for an opening 5-minute statement starting. I'm going to, since appearing by video conference is always more of a task than personally, I'm going to ask Thomas Hughes to go first, please. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is a privilege to be able to provide comment to this committee. The space domain is a complex defense issue, but it's important to appreciate that although we discuss space, the space domain is in itself an enabler. That is, actions in the space domain facilitate civilian and military actions in other domains. Consequently, thinking about the space domain in defense requires us to consider not only what happens in space, but the ripple effects of actions within the space domain. Similarly, the space domain is inherently connected to Earth, and conflict related to the space domain may be most effectively prosecuted by targeting components of the space architecture that are not actually in space. The space domain is likely to have particular significance for Canada due to the Arctic. Satellite-based communications are vital, and it is difficult to conceive of comprehensive surveillance of Canada's Arctic territory without leveraging the space domain. It also provides an opportunity for Canada to develop capabilities in the space domain that are intended to enhance our awareness of and ability to facilitate and support activity in the Arctic. From this foundation, I will draw your attention to 3 practical and conceptual challenges. The first is the dual use issue. That is, satellites can perform roles that have both military and civilian functions. Thus, satellites that are actually intended for malign use may be plausibly denied using the cover of a civilian function. For example, at a very basic level, imagery of Arctic ice taken from space can be used for scientific research or to assist in military planning. Alternatively, tracking objects in space could be to ensure that existing satellites are not in conflicting orbits, or to generate targeting coordinates to facilitate the use of an anti-satellite missile. Conversely, this raises the difficulty of demonstrating that a satellite is solely intended for benign purposes, increasing the possibility of unintended escalation. While existing surveillance capabilities provide us with a strong understanding of when objects are put into space and who is responsible for their launch, the intended function of these objects and the way in which data that they collect is intended to be used is rather more difficult to discern. The consequent inability to unequivocally differentiate between military and civilian space infrastructure adds a political element to the existing conversation about protecting our space-related assets from attack. Addressing this lacuna through national technical means and, potentially, an international confidence-building regime that generates greater clarity on the function of objects in space domain is vital. The second is the necessary interconnection of private industry and state interests in space. Private industry has been crucial to using the space domain for both civilian and military purposes, developing physical infrastructure and engaging in research. This also represents a political and operational challenge. Over-reliance on private industry may make it difficult for Canada and its partners and allies to pursue their space-related goals at the speed of need and to ensure consistent function at critical junctures. Restrictions on the use of Starlink following its provision to the Ukrainian armed forces is a reminder of this potential challenge. In addition, the sensitive nature of information that may be required by defense departments from or about the space domain complicates the interface with private industry, raising challenges in data collection and dissemination. Third, as we develop our use of the space domain, it is also important to consider how this changes others' understanding of our vulnerabilities and capabilities. Generating awareness of how others view our actions in the space domain is crucial in enabling us to maintain an effective deterrent posture without being seen as an aggressor. However, the ability to hamper adversaries from using the space domain to support their military operations is a vital capability. To be clear, we need to abide by existing regulation and understand the ethical implications of any defense-related activity in the space domain. Nevertheless, ensuring that we have awareness of the role of the space domain in adversaries' military doctrine and the capability to disrupt their use of the space domain, potentially through interdicting communication between ground stations and objects in space rather than targeting the latter directly, is a crucial aspect of future military capability, particularly as the Canadian Armed Forces moves towards a pan-domain approach to operations. Thank you.
Professor Liebrecht, 5 minutes, please.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs.
Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for this invitation. I'll be speaking English, but I'd be pleased to answer your questions in the official language of your choice.
Following scenario. China wants to fire a shot across the proverbial bow, but instead of targeting U.S. infrastructure, which would risk drawing a strong response, China targets a Canadian satellite. China has several capabilities to do so, including anti-satellite missiles and a robotic arm with which China demonstrated in 2022 that it can move a satellite out of geosynchronous orbit. Would this constitute an attack on the continent, or on Canada, or on NATO? But the space domain falls outside of the transatlantic theater. Canada needs clear and definitive answers to these questions to deter malign actors with capabilities, intent, and demonstrated will to target Canadian and allied assets in space. Deterrence also depends on qualitative overmatch of adversarial capabilities. And space depends on Canada's ability to conduct multi-domain warfare. All that presents a formidable challenge for CAF readiness and capabilities. In real dollars, today's CAF has roughly as much funding at its disposal as it did at the end of the Cold War. And the staff contingent is about 1/3 smaller. Yet its tasks have vastly expanded, in part because it has now 2 additional domains, in addition to land, sea, and air, cyber, and space. In a globally integrated threat environment, cyber and space are highly dynamic domains that are integral to the 4 core functions of D&D: reassuring allies and citizens, deterring conflict, the ability to fight, and to protect Canadians. Canadian civilian and military communications, national security, and a wide array of civilian and military functions and operations depend on space. This is especially true in the North and the Arctic, which are disproportionately dependent on space capabilities. China has deployed anti-access area denial systems along its archipelago. Canada must do likewise in the Arctic. That's because the Arctic is a critical vulnerability, where A2AD is heavily dependent on space assets. In other words, space defense is Arctic defense is continental defense, and continental defense is allied defense because it secures extended deterrence, including extended nuclear deterrence. Canada is a regional partner anchor for the Arctic, and Canada's ability to defend NATO's northern flank ultimately depends on space. Adversaries understand this, which is precisely why malign actors are actively challenging our ability to dominate and control the space domain. In other words, strategic rivalry is in full display in space, and whoever controls space is bound to control the 21st century. 4 key takeaways. If the government is actually serious about a values-based foreign policy, then Canada should be joining the ongoing U.S. effort to bolster the Outer Space Treaty, to which both Russia and China are signatories. This established functional regime's deterioration or abrogation would run fundamentally counter to Canada's values and interests. Canada must support approaches that regulate not just space capabilities, but also how these capabilities are used. Canada must make multilateral space diplomacy a top priority. In years to come, there will be 2 new UN open-ended working groups, one on each approach. 2, Canada needs a whole-of-government approach to space to forge a coherent national strategy. But with limited resources, execution of a space defense strategy requires Canada to double down on collaboration with allies and the private sector. See the Combined Space Operations Vision 2031, a Five Eyes effort with France and Germany that I submitted to the committee. Our space policy framework dates back to 2014. 3, space is a prime example why culture evolution matters to the CAF. When the US stood up Space Command, it was quite unlike other commands. Its institutional culture is flat. It recruited from other services, and Space Command is heavily civilian because the skill sets are not readily found in the military. 4, modern militaries cannot operate without space technologies, capabilities, and data. In the event of a conflict, Canadian space defense capabilities afford allies strategic depth and will have a key multiplier effect on allies. Canada's support to Ukraine in the form of geostrategic intelligence is one indication.
Thank you. Mr. Allison, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you, our witnesses, for being here today. Christian, I'm going to start with you. I mean, that seems to make sense. I mean, it seems obvious that we should be spending time and money in space because trying to police or trying to manage the Arctic seems almost impossible from a physical asset point of view. I mean, what kind of money are we looking at here? You talk about flat budgets. We talk about, the same type of budget we had after the Cold War. We talk about shrinking members of the force. I mean, where do you even begin to start in terms of trying to prioritize that? We all know the Arctic's important. We all know that everything you said makes complete and total sense. So where do we start?
I'll give a short answer so you can come back with more challenges on this. But I think ultimately, given the challenges the Defense Force has, and given that we have a pretty good defense policy update, but no real means the government has laid out to resource that effectively, I think we need to focus disproportionately on asymmetric capabilities. That is to say, cyber and space, precisely of the strategic depth argument that I made, precisely because it has that force multiplier effect for NATO's northern flank and for ultimately continental, Arctic, and Canadian sovereignty. And so my worry is that we're actually having too much debate about the conventional domains because that's what we can all see, and that's what many parliamentarians like because it brings money and resources into their writings, and we're not having enough of a conversation about cyber and space and the disproportionate allocation in this heavily resource-constrained environment, because that's also what's going to have the multiplier effect for Canadian prosperity, Canadian innovation, the Diana Accelerator that Canada is hosting on part of NATO. So there's a lot of second-order effects if we would focus more on that conversation.
And you're saying, we should be doing all of the above, meaning we should be working with the U.S. in terms of treaties, Five Eyes, all these things, as well as private. I mean, you mentioned the concerns about that, but where should the money be spent? Directly through defense or in the collaboration of trying to wheel with other partners?
So I think what I submitted to the committee, the Five Eyes German-French initiative with a clear vision for 2031, this is where we need to put our resources. If you read that document, I think it is the best articulation in a short form that I've found of the challenges and how we work together to make that happen, draw clear red lines, deter our adversaries, and enable the capabilities that we need, everything from fighting forest fires to ensuring continuity of communications, civilian assets, and the like. So I think we have a very clear target, and given that Canada has signed on to it, the challenge is how do we actually translate that into effective outcomes? Because, as you know, Canada often has perfunctory announcements about defense, but then we have trouble meeting it. And here's one that if we allocate our resources and capabilities effectively, I think we can actually meet that commitment, and it will offer us disproportionate payoff and reputational asset among our key Five Eyes allies plus France and Germany. So this is easier from a multilateral perspective because you have 7 countries playing together as opposed to all of NATO, for instance.
In terms of dealing with China and Russia, who are you concerned with more? I mean, in terms of this whole race in space. I mean, China's been coming on strong, but what keeps you awake at night in terms of those countries and why?
So that's a terrific question. If I can only find it, I have a nice little synopsis on that. But the basic point is this, so we put a lot of emphasis on Russia and sort of the Russian claims of putting sort of potentially nuclear weapons up into space. Yes, we should be concerned about that, but look, nuclear weapons are 70-year-old technology. The Chinese have very disruptive technologies that they've demonstrated they know how to use and deploy. That robo-arm, that was a real wake-up in the US and allied defense community. The ability to displace a satellite out of orbit, that's a pretty sophisticated capability. And so this ability for targeted disruption rather than sort of this one big bang, boom sort of approach that Russia takes. And look, China has the second most satellites only to the United States. And China has demonstrated that it is a clear peer rival in its investments, in its capabilities, where we have disproportionate leverage, and the United States understands this, is by playing together among longstanding key allies that have long-developed space capabilities and investing strategically in those. And of course, the innovation is going to come from private sector investment that we then need to be able to translate into dual use and military applications. The problem is our processes in Canada for doing that are so long. If you look at how the US has changed its defense procurement mechanism precisely to be able to accelerate that exponentially, I think this is one more reason why we really need to look at our procurement system, which of course is one of the department's priorities.
Well, and I guess, not that we're going to be meeting our NATO commitment, but we should be investing in Canadian. If we're going to be committing money towards defense and towards those numbers, it should be investing in Canadian companies versus other companies.
If you add up the defense policy update, I don't know why the government didn't put this out there, but in my view, the defense policy update, if the government is serious about resourcing it, it gets us to 2% and more. Why we're actually underplaying our hand with the defense policy update, which I think is a pretty good update. Okay, I'm not quite sure.
Thank you, Mr. Allison. Mr. Fillmore, 6 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks very much to the witnesses for your time and for bringing your expertise to the committee today. In the framing of this study that you're now contributing to, the committee acknowledged that we don't know what we don't know. So if we could, I'd like to use the next 5 or 6 minutes, whichever the chair is giving us right now, to ask you both to educate the committee on the importance of Arctic defense in the context of space. And if I could ask you both to keep in mind as you answer your questions what the role of industry is in this, and also framing your responses somewhere along the way in terms of a recommendation that the committee could then include in its report. I guess we'll start in the order that we heard from the speakers and start with Dr. Hughes, and I'll try to keep the time split in half, 3 minutes each, if we could.
Thank you very much. They're big questions, but to be brief, the importance of Arctic defense in the context of space, I completely agree with Professor Luprecht's conceptualization of this. Arctic defense is one of the niche capabilities that Canada provides, in my opinion, and I think it's useful for Canada, given the current security context, to focus on some of those niche capabilities that it has. The Arctic, therefore, offers an opportunity for Canada to engage in that process. As I said in my initial comments, for Canada to have a comprehensive defense of its Arctic territory, it is absolutely fundamental to leverage the space domain. This is in terms of communications, to start with, and secondly, surveillance, whether that's using the new Sky Guardian, a remotely piloted aircraft, which I know are due to come into operation in 2028. They will require satellite communication to function, whether that's satellite imagery itself. We cannot surveil the Arctic. We cannot have domain awareness of the Arctic itself without the ability to operate in space. That will require, in my opinion, that Canada engages with international partners particularly Sweden, I think is an interesting additional partner that hasn't been mentioned so far. I know that relationship is already built and is already strong, and I think that is something which should probably be leveraged further. In terms of private industry is simply critical. Private industry has the expertise and the capability to produce what the Canadian Armed Forces require. The challenge, as always, is ensuring that that private industry, which is necessarily operating with a different framework of meaning, if you like, from the government, is on the same page, that we can actually work in parallel. We can, but that's not something which happens automatically.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Luprecht, if we could move to you, and I remember you did say something in your remarks about space defense is Arctic defense, and you had more in that long sentence. Perhaps that would help to frame your response.
Yeah, so I guess to reiterate that sentence, so that space defense is Arctic defense. Arctic defense is ultimately continental defense. Continental defense is defending the northern flank of NATO, which of course has become, and NATO's center of gravity with the addition of Sweden and Finland has shifted north. So the northern flank has become more important. But the really important thing, and I think Canada's always done a terribly poor job at articulating this, that investments in Arctic security are investments in NATO and NATO collective defense. Because collective defense depends on U.S. extended deterrence and U.S. extended nuclear deterrence. If the continent is not secure, then it means the United States' ability to deter adversary is not secure. And yet, for some reason, repeated governments on both sides have not, in my view, articulated that effectively, either to the Canadian public and especially to our allies and partners. We still somehow articulate these as somehow separate separate entities, and you can see how the defense policy update was rolled out in this emphasis on the Arctic. I guess the three things that I would reiterate, I think more than just kind of where we put the resources. So one, inexpensive allocation, but I'm concerned that in terms of multilateral diplomacy, we have very limited resources. And as you know, the government of the day decides, and the government has decided to constrain resources of departments further. And the government has decided to put its multilateral efforts in a separate treaty process. Democratic government, it gets to do what it decides to do. But I think it needs to be all hands on deck when it comes to multilateral space diplomacy, because that is existential to Canadian defense and to allied and continental defense for the reasons I just explained. The whole of government approach, the defense policy framework dates back to 2014. A lot has changed in space since 2014. If we have very scarce resources, both in government and in collaboration with industry, we need to marshal those resources for maximum effect and efficiency in terms of outputs and outcomes. If we don't have an updated framework, we can't marshal the resources that we have. And I think on the defense capability side, I think thinking about the people who actually do this is a classic example of where the Canadian Armed Forces need extremely high-level, high-quality skill sets. This is a clear change over the last 30 years. That the people you need to recruit, it's not that there's not enough people coming through the doors. There's enough people coming through the doors. The quality of the people that Canadian Armed Forces need, it is not able to get through the doors, especially in these very high-end capabilities. And so here we need opportunities for lateral entry and from the civilian private sector and from other government departments. And look, it's just taken me 2 years to get someone from a different formation to come and work in our formation. That's within the Canadian Armed Forces and Department of National Defense. We are not agile when it comes to personnel.
Thank you, Mr. Fillmore. Madame Normandin, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être une...
Thank you very much. A first question, Dr. Hughes. You mentioned the difficulty in establishing what is private versus what is military in space and in terms of its use. But do we have some idea of the ratio of what would be governmental versus private in the use of space? And is there a trend? For instance, the private sector may be sort of winning in space, or would it be the military or the government side that's sort of winning that war? Just to give an order.
Merci pour ton
Thank you for your question.
question.
I'll answer in English.
Putting an absolute number on that is very difficult. The primary problem being that, as I suggested, a lot of the space infrastructure and the satellites can be used for both civilian and military function. So a particular object, a particular satellite may be performing a completely civilian role for a time and a season. And then if the government to whom that satellite belongs decides to change that function, or rather, perhaps more specifically, to use the data that that satellite is collecting for a military purpose, then there's no way that we can stop that from happening. So I am somewhat reluctant to put a figure on military versus civilian. And I think that is part of the challenge of operating and understanding the space domain and the threat environment that is in the space domain. In terms of private versus government, I think to take your question a little further, what would be useful is to see that breakdown by country, because the Chinese government obviously has a different relationship with Chinese private industry than the United States does with US private industry. And again, that raises this challenge of the dual use problem and that public-private interface. I would suggest in the United States in particular, the private industry has a lead in terms of what it is providing. We've seen that with SpaceX and Boeing in recent years. But again, a significant proportion of that need is also driven by armed forces. Again, I would hesitate to put a number on that, but it would perhaps be more useful to think broadly about what capabilities the United States and Canada require in space and whether those capabilities are being met.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. A question for you, Professor Luprecht. You mentioned it obliquely, but I'd like you to go a bit further into detail on this. What is the risk to Canada versus its allies if there is a continued underfunding of space? You've already somewhat addressed it about the Arctic and deterrence that we have to take part in along with our allies, the U.S. We depend a lot on what the U.S. can provide to us in terms of intelligence. But what would be the other, for instance, reputational risks vis-a-vis our allies if we keep underfunding?
Madame Normandin.
Thank you, Madame Normandin, for the question. I'll give you a very concrete example. Today, in the Baltic states, there are current civilian flights that have to change their flight path because of GPS interference by Russian forces in civil aviation. There are a number of airports in Baltic states where you can only land thanks to satellites. We have the same issue in the Arctic. In many airports, you can only land thanks to the support of satellites, and Russia is close enough to have this effect in the Arctic. If the Russians so choose, they could exploit significant vulnerabilities in the high north with their interference capabilities within the GPS systems for civilian and military aviation. And that, I believe, is a significant vulnerability that we should address as a priority.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Another question for you. You addressed the issue of Article 5 in space, and the problem being that it is difficult sometimes to relate satellites to certain continents. Do we have the same problem as we do in the cyber field? In cyber, the issue is to associate an action with a perpetrator. Is it the same issue in space, where it would be difficult to know who might have destroyed or what forces might have destroyed or hijacked a satellite? The issue of attribution is actually not that difficult. The problem is that we don't have the capacity for attribution that we are used to, which means from a legal standpoint, beyond a reasonable doubt as being the standard. But through our intelligence capabilities, we can attribute these actions, and specifically the Russians. The Russians, they don't even hide their interventions. On the contrary, they want us to know that they were responsible for this interference that caused the chaos. And because at the end of the day, the Russian strategy is to see the world burn.
Ms. Normandine, Ms. Matson, 6 minutes.
Sorry, that was quite an end point. In terms of that commercialization of space, Dr. Hughes, I'd like to talk to you. I certainly have my concerns in terms of the movement that we have seen away from potentially government-funded space exploration, like the International Space Station, the accords that's provided, and this move towards that commercialization of space. Now, in the last meeting that we had on this, there was a belief that in the building of peace and diplomacy, that the commercial interests could do that just as easily, if not better, than governments had in the past, and from that commercial side, that through regulation, government would still have a say in how they move forward. Can I get your thoughts on that?
Certainly. So in terms of the regulation, commercial entities obviously have a significant interest in maintaining the space as a peaceful domain. It's entirely antithetical to what most companies would be looking to achieve if regulation was sufficiently loose as to facilitate aggression within the space domain. I would suggest that ultimately that regulation will come from states. If it is going to be effective, as Dr. Lubrecht had mentioned, this is going to have to come through a state-based framework. Ultimately, the commercialization of space will fall under the jurisdiction of state government. If a state government has understood itself to be under threat from a commercial satellite, then I would suggest that that is not going to prevent them from disrupting that satellite, disrupting those space operations. So whilst private industry should be, I would suggest, heavily involved in what is happening in the space domain and having that partnership with commercial organizations to understand what is happening in the space domain is important. Ultimately, that regulation is going to have to come, in my opinion, from individual states.
Considering the fact that, this certainly isn't new. We haven't, and governments haven't done that as of yet, correct? In terms of monitoring that power dynamic, that monopoly situation, like we do see with SpaceX. The American government is now exclusively working to build hundreds of spy satellites with SpaceX, and we saw what happened in terms of Ukraine. The fact that government hasn't moved in that direction, is that concerning? How can we be concerned that governments will, or what are we seeing in that respect, I guess?
I share your concern, again, because the frameworks within which those commercial organizations are operating are going to differ from individual states. State governments, particularly Canada and its partners and allies, will require very robust agreements with those commercial entities. In my opinion, I am not fundamentally convinced that will ever be entirely sufficient. Ultimately, the state will have to rely on an entity which has potentially different interests, unless we end up constricting ourselves to only working with companies from our own states, and I don't think that would be particularly helpful. So yes, that commercialization component does concern me. I think fundamentally, Canada, again, and its allies and partners really need to articulate its point of need in the space domain to understand what capabilities are required and to understand who is best positioned to provide those. And part of that conversation around who is best positioned to provide those is understanding what the interests are of the private entity who's going to be behind them. So yes, I do share your concern. I think the issues with Starlink in Ukraine should act as a wake-up call, if you like, for that potential future challenge.
Both of you, as academics, how does this further impact academia's access to research, and if it's fully commercialized or it's dominated only by one company, as per se?
Thank you, Ms. Madsen. We're on to the 5-minute round, and we have 20 minutes. So 4 minutes. We're on to a 4-minute round. Ms. Gallant.
My questions are for Professor Luprecht. We're an adversary to spoof the U.S. GPS satellite system that we use. Describe the impact it would have on our weapons and navigation systems.
That's a great question. I don't need to describe it to you. You just need to look at the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and you can see what happens when, on a large scale, entities end up jamming global positioning statements and the disruption that it causes to civilian life. You have a real-life laboratory, and it's... and in addition, not just the capability to disrupt, but of course, China and its Baidu constellation has its own GPS capabilities, so it is not reliant on the North American system.
What about our weapons systems?
So redundancy is key, and I'll give you an analogy in an area where we've made adjustments. So Russia has, for over a decade, actively been jamming, as you probably know, NATO vessels. And this is why, until about 2015 or so, the U.S. Navy had relied entirely on GPS systems, and why the U.S. Navy went back to star navigation. So the capability to operate without GPS. And so one of the risks that we currently have is a single point of failure if all we do is rely on US-based GPS capabilities. This is why redundancy is important, and this is why multi-domain capabilities are important, so that, as we do in any other domain of warfare, where we never just have one single system on which we are reliant. And I'm concerned about the over-reliance in Canada on potential single points of failure in space.
So we don't have a backup the way the U.S. Navy has the star navigational system.
I better let the Canadian Armed Forces speak to the redundancy capabilities that we have.
Okay, so when Russia deploys an anti-satellite weapon into space, such as putting multiple nuclear weapons in orbit, does Canada or any ally have the right to disable the weapon if it poses an imminent threat to our satellites?
I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you. You'd need to ask the JAG on what the international law constraints are and our proper legal constraints. As I pointed out in my opening statement, I'm concerned that we in Canada have not done enough heavy lifting to answer precisely these types of questions, what our response would be, and what our cooperation, both with the United States and among other allied partners, in particular middle power partners, would be. If the United States is busy in other conflicts, we need to be able to respond with other partners.
Okay, so we're a foreign adversary to hack into a satellite or a satellite network to disable or hijack it. Would that constitute an act of war, or what type of response would be justified on the part of Canada or any other nations this happened to, who are signatories on the Outer Space Treaty?
So my best understanding is that the problem is that the answers to precisely these questions are currently ambiguous. Precisely because, for instance, NATO Article 5, it's not clear. Would that apply? Under what circumstances would it apply? What aspects, other than the 5 space treaties to which Canada is a signatory would apply in this domain. And this is precisely why the UN has proposed an open-ended working group on both capabilities and a separate one on behaviors. There's a problem of agreement on the parameters of those working groups, but I'm confident those will get off the ground in the very near future. And Canada, of course, needs to be prepared to be a very active player, as hard as it's going to be to get an international consensus.
Thank you, Ms. Gallant. Ms. Lalonde, I think you're deferring your time to Mr. Fillmore. Is that correct? Mr. Fillmore, 4 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'd like to go a little further on the topic raised by Ms. Matheson, if I could. We've heard from Dr. Hughes about, I don't know, let's call them the ambiguities in the legal framework governing space security, and very likely the development of shared behavioral norms. That just came up in the last question, actually. But Dr. Leuprecht, you said that Canada must join the ongoing effort to bolster the U.S. space treaty and that multilateral diplomacy has to be a priority. Well, historically, space treaties have been negotiated between nation states. But as we've heard this evening, the private sector is having a more and more active role in space. So it seems like the place we need to get to is where private entities, the industry sector, needs to be participating in these treaties. Is there any precedent? Do we have any tools that can help private sector to involve themselves in the treaties, such as the one you've mentioned? Maybe we could start with Dr. Leuprecht and then Dr. Hughes, if there's time.
I just have a short answer for you. It is actually one of the strengths that Canada has. Because we're smaller, it's much easier for government departments and agencies to talk to one another, and for us to talk to both non-governmental organizations and the private sector, and to forge a common way forward in how we harness that. So we have a comparative advantage to the United States, where, of course, this is a rather large behemoth to try to figure out where the bus is going and to get everybody on that bus.
So, for example, in our work that you recommend that we undertake with the United States on updating the space treaty, is there a role for the private sector to be present at that table? Either one of you.
I'll defer on that question in the sense that I don't know enough about the technicalities of how space treaties are negotiated.
Okay. Dr. Hughes, is there anything you'd like to add to that in answer to that?
Just to build a little bit on Dr. Leuprecht's point, I would suggest that a place at the table in terms of international discussion probably is not the place for private industry. However, it absolutely is the case that private industry should be heavily involved when the negotiating positions are being created by the states. Because, again, as we've heard within this conversation, private industry have been so heavily involved in the development of space technology and space capabilities that having them as part of that discussion to an extent is going to be critical. And okay. Also, if I may, just to point to the recommendations that you'd suggested, I think one first recommendation that I would have is that we really simply need a clear articulation of our needs with regards to defense in the space domain. It is such a huge topic and brings together so many different facets of Canadian life that articulation is simply not there at the moment. We have a broad collection of understandings of the consequences of action in the space domain, but to bring that together into a coherent package would be really very useful.
Okay, thank you both very much. I think I'm probably out of time.
You aren't, but where you are now. Minute and a half, Ms. Normandine.
Merci beaucoup, Professeur Leuprecht.
Thank you very much. Professor Leuprecht, in your notes you mentioned the importance of regulating not only space capabilities, but also their use. For instance, we've seen with dual use, it's very difficult. Satellite imagery can be used both can be used for military purposes. I'd like to hear what you have to say about the actual real possibility that we could regulate, or there could be regulations, especially given the fact that people might have malicious intent. You know, think of China claiming that things are done for civilian purposes, but they're actually done for military purposes? Is it realistic to have regulations on the use of space? Yes, ma'am, because there is a strong incentive, and that would be the economy of space. In other words, the capacity for resources that are in space, or the economy of space. It's about $600 billion a year we're talking about. By 2035, the economy will be at $1.3 trillion, specifically to mine resources in space, actually, and to deploy the necessary resources to take advantage of this economy in space. There need to be international regulations as to the use of capabilities, the use of the technology that is used in space.
Dean, Ms. Massa, a minute and a half.
Dr. Lügebrecht, you sent us the combined space operations vision. It stated some nations have developed capabilities designed to deny, degrade, disrupt access and the utilization of space-based capabilities. And then it talked about the goal of collaboration across a range of measures, developing requirements for current future systems to counter hostile space activities, to deter, deny, or defeat attacks or interference with space enterprise. Now, if we're looking back at history, there's this consistence of the horrific ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons existing today because they're a process or a product of, a cycle of anti-missile system defense systems, and they spur innovations, and that creates bigger weapons and more so in terms of that arms race. This is the final frontier, I guess, if we want to get geeky about it. So how do we not make the same mistakes that we have here on Earth as in space? How do we deter? How do we find that diplomacy in this current world we live in?
And we have a peer competitor, strategic rival in China, which is able to compete at scale in space with the United States and with the Western Alliance. And the effort of China, of course, to disrupt the status quo of the rules-based order, not just on Earth, but in cyberspace and in space. And of course, Canada, as a middle power, has a key interest in preserving the status quo. And that's why Canada has a keen interest in establishing clear behavioral norms. But I think the incentive is space mining, precisely because that's where the opportunity is the same for China as it is for all other countries. And I think one of the opportunities Canada has is to ensure, for instance, equal access to space. How do we get other countries to come on board with our approaches to space? We ensure equal access to space, and we ensure ethical access to space.
We're going to have to leave the answer there,
technologies.
please. Thank you. Mr. Bazan, 4 minutes. 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both our witnesses. So you're talking about increasing space diplomacy with our adversaries, and I'm sure you're meaning Russia and the People's Republic of China. I looked at the Outer Space Treaty. It was signed in 1967 with the USSR, so technically not Russia, but you hope Russia is still going to abide by it. But, of course, Russia is talking about the using nuclear weapons in space. Do we trust the Russian Federation or Vladimir Putin and the People's Republic of China to actually honor any treaty that they sign?
So my argument to this would be is there needs to be a two-level effort, right? So the effort that we just talked about in terms of building international norms, what Canada has traditionally done well, but which, for instance, in the cyber domain for 25 years has not gotten us anywhere. So in the absence of international norms, we need to work on deterrence, and we need to work on capabilities for certain elements of punishment, whether it's kinetic or non-kinetic, for countries that cross over certain red lines. And we also need to do that, I think, outside of U.S. leadership.
Do you think the Russian Federation or the People's Republic of China is going to sign it? Because you're familiar with the Budapest Memorandum, I'm sure, and Russia didn't honor that when they invaded Ukraine. I'm sure you're familiar with Minsk I and Minsk II treaties, and the Russian Federation never honored those. You know, they were supposed to be on the nuclear non-proliferation. They were supposed to reduce the overall nuclear arsenal they had, and instead they've ramped up the production of nuclear weapons. And then Beijing had signed with the United Kingdom the Sino-British Joint Declaration Treaty, and that was supposed to be good till 2047, and they walked away from it in 2014. So why would we trust anyone to sign this when they're both very interested in having that strategic advantage in space?
And that's why we're in front of the National Defense Committee and not the Foreign Affairs Committee, precisely because we need those deterrence capabilities, because the other way, if we can't agree on norms, we can forge norms if our adversaries know there are very real consequences on which we are prepared to follow through if they cross certain red lines. Thomas might have something to say on this as well.
Yes, thank you. It's a fascinating question, and I would suggest that the first answer and short answer is no. We simply cannot assume that simply because rules are in place that they will be followed. I think it is worth noting that Russia and China have both proposed some forms of rules in space. I think it's also worth noting that Russia has rejected the approach of norms regarding space activities and suggested that a fully legal regime would be more appropriate. My inclination in that is that particularly Russia will use the rules to the extent that they benefit Russia. So if we are going to develop a rules-based framework, which I do think would be helpful, we have to bear in mind that Russia must see it as being at least of parallel benefit to them as to what they consider to be their peers. The key point in the whole conversation around space military activity, in my opinion, is verification. So if we can create a framework of rules which facilitate some form of verification that we are confident provides us with sufficient information on the capabilities that Russia and China are deploying and the capabilities that they are attempting to deploy, and from there develop an understanding of their intent in the space domain, then those rules and regulations can be useful in their own right, even if we also need to augment them by the deterrent function that Dr. Lubrecht mentioned.
We're unfortunately going to have to leave the answer there. Thank you. Ms. Lalonde, 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, I want to say thank you to both of our witnesses for being here. I was very happy to see that we were undertaking a study actually on space defense, and I think you're validating the notion of why this is so important, particularly in this committee. There was also references about space defense being, and I'll quote, emerging domain, and certainly the development that are occurring at an increasingly rapid pace, and we're talking about that dollar figure, but also just the reality of where that brings us. I would like to know from both of you, are there barriers to researching space defense as an emerging domain? And if there's a lack of information on existing research, data, or sources to rely on? Merci.
So 2 points on that. If you look at Australia, Australia has a Centre for Space Governance. We have nothing comparable in this country. So we need to generate the capabilities of what are our interests and how do we assert them in a multilateral governance framework. It is something I think we have not quite grasped in terms of, and it requires government leadership. The other is my concern about research security, because Ms. Matheson, Madame Normandin, others have talked about the research investments and capabilities. The government has put forward, finally, a framework on research security, but it, of course, does not include any private sector actors in China. It only includes public sector research, military intelligence institutions. And so we need to understand that if we're going to invest in research in this country, in space, that we need to provide adequate research security. And adequate research security means we can't then collaborate or let people collaborate with Chinese entities that are going to leverage the dual-use capabilities that Canadian taxpayers are paying for to advance Chinese capabilities in space.
Thank you. Mr. Hughes.
Just to add on to that point briefly, the funding incentivization point is going to be critical here as well. So if we are going to have meaningful research, particularly around space defense in the academic realm and around laws governing the military component of space, then the funding needs to be there for that to happen. And where does that incentivization come from? And the ability for scholars to engage in that research process requires that those funds are available as well.
Thank you very much. And maybe I'll leave you both to share very quickly key recommendation that we could be bringing forward as this is a study that we're doing on space defense.
A higher risk tolerance for government to invest in research capabilities, and the willingness to fail and to fail quickly and subvent the private sector by putting that out. We've built some of that in defense, but we've been very reticent at allowing that investment to go towards defense, to go towards space capabilities.
Yeah, okay. And Dr. Hughes?
I would reiterate my point about fundamental understanding and articulation of needs regarding space. And a second recommendation from there is understanding Canada's niche capabilities and opportunities within that multilateral defense framework.
Thank you very much.
And unfortunately, I have to gavel this meeting to a close. You've raised some really interesting points, which I hope the committee will have an opportunity to explore. Before I do adjourn, however, I just take note that we are meeting with Minister Pistorius from the German Defense Ministry on Friday at 12:15 in room 125B West Block, and I'd like to exchange a gift with him, and I appreciate it if someone would be in a position to move a motion to do so. Ms. Lalonde.
Mr. Chair, it'll be a pleasure for me to help you on this, and I think at the will of the committee. And I'll bring this motion that in relation to the committee's informal meeting with the German Minister of Defense, the committee covered the cost of a gift for the German Defense Minister.
Okay, thank you. Any debate? Good. Seems a little excessive.